wondered what you get if you cross Jane Austen with magic? Wonder no more. Jonathan Strange and Mr Norrell. It took me literally months to read because this book is the equivalent of a brick. It is very dense, but also very, very good. It's also quite a difficult book to talk about because it doesn't really have an obvious plot, which is unusual for fantasy. It is a fantasy book, historical fantasy. There isn't an end goal the characters are working towards. There's no princess to save. There's no MacGuffin to find. There's no big bad to defeat. There's no throne to assume. It's just sort of the restoration of English magic is the heart of the story, but they don't have to find the missing stone of Antioch and return it to the Raven King's crown. It's nothing like that. It's just people doing stuff. But let's set the scene. So this book takes place between 1806 and 1817, which is the Regency era of Britain, which was when George III was king but was insane, and so his son George IV was looking after the kingdom for him as the Prince Regent, hence Regency era. William Pitt the Younger had just died, so basically it is Blackadder III, but slightly after. That is when this is set. The book is split into 3 volumes. The first being Mr Norrell, the second being Jonathan Strange, and the third being John Usglass. I don't know how you say his name. There's a K and a G next to each other. It's very confusing. And honestly, it's difficult to call anything a spoiler until you actually get to the third book. Everything up until that point is just sort of stuff, and it's not till then that all the threads start to come together. But the first 2 are basically there to establish the cast and to give the reader a sense of the wider world and how magic is used and seen in the current era. So the first section, Mr Norrell, is about Mr Norrell, who's a Yorkshire magician and the only user of practical magic left in England. His hobbies include hoarding magical books in his fancy library and dissolving groups of theoretical magicians by challenging them to, not duels, but sort of magic offs, with the sort of deal that whoever loses has to renounce magic. And of course, because he's the only one who can use magic, he always wins, and thus several magicians are no longer able to call themselves magicians, and they don't actually do magic, so... He eventually goes to London with the idea of bringing honour back to English magic by helping with the war effort, because at this point in history, England were fighting the French, as we usually are. The specific incident is the Napoleonic Wars, when Napoleon was charging through Europe to take over and section it off and give it to his family. So that's what the first section is about, in a way. It's Norrell helping in London and doing various bits and bobs and stuff. The second section, Jonathan Strange. Jonathan Strange is a Shropshire rich kid who picks up magic to impress a girl. He ends up going to London as well and becomes the pupil of Mr Norrell, and also helps with the war effort, except this time he actually goes out to the war zones. He goes to Portugal and then Belgium for the Battle of Waterloo, alongside the Duke of Wellington, who does appear in this book, which is quite fun. The third volume, John Usglass, is where things do get, I'm not exciting, but you do see a kind of various threads do start to pull together a lot more. And sort of there is a shift in the way magic is portrayed, I suppose. But I won't go too much into that because it's quite exciting. But you need to have read everything else first, otherwise it makes no sense. And honestly, I don't think I can really say a huge amount more. If you're not sold yet on whether or not to read this book, even though you definitely should read it, there are fairies in it. I'm very excited about fairies. And what's cool about these fairies is they are a pretty accurate telling of what fairies used to be like before the Victorians came along with their silly ideas of little people with wings and acorn caps for hats. These fairies are mischievous. This sort of like a changeling idea of fairy. These kind of otherworldly characters, very powerful but sneaky. So if you're interested at all in that element of magic or history, you should just read it. You should just read it anyway. It's a really good book. It also does explore themes like sexism and racism and classism, like, you know. So if you're interested in social issues too, it does go into that. Now at this point I would usually go in to talk about the pros and cons of books, but I don't really think I want to with this one. Mostly because I think it's all really, really good. I don't think I can talk about anything that isn't well done. It's very, very well put together. But I'm also aware that a lot of the things I might consider pros, other people might not necessarily like. Those people are wrong. No. It's basically the difference in something being objectively bad and then differences in subjective taste. The things in this book are not bad because then they're quite neutral. They're neutral things. Some people like, some people don't like, and I don't think that's something to be changed. So instead I'm just going to talk about the things in the book. They're all things I like, and how some elements may not appeal to other people. So let's talk about the pros first. Now the reason I mentioned Jane Austen earlier is not just because it's set in a similar time period, but it's actually because this book very much replicates that style of writing, the sort of formality and ostentatiousness. That's not a word. Oh well, the style. Mostly, it's not completely. I don't think, purely because while I like Austen, I need to know what's going on before I read it. I have to watch like the film or the series first, otherwise I get confused. With this, I found it actually very easy to follow. I don't know if that's just because I've gotten better at reading oldie worldy styles, in which case I should probably try Dickens again, or if it's just because it is a modern author replicating the style, which one can never do perfectly. That aside, the prose is excellent. It's perhaps jarring slightly at times because the author does use older spellings of some words. So choose, she spells CHUSE. Connection's got an X in it. Switzerland is Swisserland, like stuff like that. And it was how those words were spelt back in the day. So it was a little bit weird when you kind of come across it and was like, oh, okay, that's an interesting spelling. But they're perfectly valid. And aside from that, like, the rest of the prose is impeccable. It's really, really excellently done, and you can tell that she spent like 13 years writing this. It's so polished. It's also really funny. This is one of those books that I actually laughed out loud whilst reading, and I don't do that very often. I can't specifically remember any moments that made me laugh, but there are a lot of them, and part of it is just the prose is very witty. There are some really funny moments with the dialogue, which I'm hoping have been translated to the BBC adaptation, but I'll talk about that later. And other parts are just really beautiful. Susanna Clarke has done a really, really good job of capturing the wonder of the English countryside and these sort of little snowy villages in winter and the forests and the folkloric nature of the wild of England. It's beautiful. The only thing I think people might find off-putting, aside from the oldie style of writing, is that she uses a lot of footnotes. Like an essay, like a little number, and at the bottom there's a thing explaining something. And sometimes these footnotes are just sort of definitions of words, or almost like a bibliography, like, oh, this is the book they referenced, it's this book by X written in Y. And sometimes they're full-on anecdotes or stories that span pages, and there are times where the footnotes are longer than the actual prose. I really liked the footnotes. I thought they were a really interesting way of adding depth to the world and actually making sure the reader was aware of the sort of cultural surroundings of everything that was being said. So when like phrases or things were mentioned by characters, which other characters would understand, but the reader would not because it's something of the author's invention. The footnotes kind of keep you up to speed so you get what they mean by that. But a lot of people do find them annoying. Whenever I've mentioned to people, I'm reading this book that's got loads of footnotes, they kind of go, oh, I hate footnotes in books, I don't like them at all. So that's all the sort of things I mean by it's not an objective problem to have footnotes, but some people don't like them. But I think you should, give it a go anyway. Oh, that was loud. Oops, traffic. I think you should give it a go anyway, because they are fun to read and you can ignore them. I wouldn't ignore them because they are quite important, but you can, probably. Next, I'm going to talk about the characters, who are also very good. They feel like real people, which is always helpful when writing characters. What I liked especially is that none of the characters are necessarily good or evil, because, there isn't a big bad defeat. There aren't the sort of us versus them. It's not good versus evil. It's just characters. It's just people. And so most of the conflict doesn't come from good and evil. The conflict just comes from differing opinions. Mostly those between the two main characters, Jonathan Strange and Mr Norrell, who have different ideas about magic, and some people agree with one and some people agree with the other, and that's where a lot of the tension is. Some of the tension is other stuff too, obviously. Now obviously I know which one I agree with out of Strange and Norrell, but that doesn't mean the other one is wrong. It's just different opinions and different ways of looking at things. Mr Norrell is a good magician. He thinks before he acts. He's very aware of the limitations of magic and the dangers of it, but he's also very selfish. He hoards all these magic books and doesn't let other people look at them. A lot of these books are very, very rare, and he sort of swipes them under the nose from other magicians. He is both desperate for another magician, so he's not alone as being the only practical magician in England, but he also fears that another magician might sort of overtake him. He sort of both wants to keep all his books secret, but also wants to share them with other magicians. And they work well together, these sort of differing sides of his character. They don't feel like a character who doesn't make sense, it just feels like a character who is conflicted inside. So, whereas Norrell is quite fearful, Jonathan Strange is very arrogant. He does magic willy-nilly. He wants to push the boundaries. He wants to create new spells. He is hyper-focused and often neglects the people around him. He's obsessive. And his sort of natural skill and curiosity do get him into situations he doesn't understand because he doesn't have the knowledge. So you can sort of see how these two characters do play off each other and focus on different elements of magic and why they're both important, but why they also butt heads. There are obviously a load more characters in the book. I'll only talk about a few of them, even though there are a lot of them and they're all really good. My favourite character is Stephen Black. Love him. I find him really funny. Who is a butler who works for a character called Sir Walter Pole. He's a black character, as in like African descent, whose mother was a slave in the Americas. He, having been born on the sea and being brought to England, meant that he has never actually been a slave himself. Slavery was abolished on English soil in 1772, but England still supported slavery in other places, so it's only a small victory, I guess. He's an interesting character because although he acts quite sophisticated and he's got this sort of very British stiff upper lip when weird stuff happens around him, to which he responds, okay, I can deal with that. He is still black and he's still a servant, and people still do see him differently because of that. And it gives interesting dimension to the book, having most characters the upper class white society, and then having this other character who is neither of those things. And although the book isn't like about like racism and stuff, it does incorporate it quite well and doesn't shy away from the fact that England was kind of racist at that point. And there's some really interesting observations that I just hadn't really thought of before. So there's a section where Stephen's running errands in the countryside and people wonder things like if like black of his skin will rub off on things he touches, and if he eats the same as like normal folk, and whether or not he can speak English. There's a quote that I wanted to read out because I really liked it. It pleased me. Well, it didn't. I thought it was interesting. So I'll read it out. Maybe I'll cut this later, I don't know. Stephen hesitated. Your skin is marked and discoloured. I thought perhaps the marks meant you had a disease of some sort. That is not what my skin means, said Vinculus. Means, said Stephen. That is an odd word to use. Yet it is true. Skin can mean a great deal. Mine means that any man may strike me in a public place and never fear the consequences. It means that my friends do not always like to be seen with me in the street. It means that no matter how many books I read or languages I master, I will never be anything but a curiosity, like a talking pig or a mathematical horse. He's a very well-spoken character, and I love every page he was on. So yeah, he's my favourite. He's very fun. The other characters worth mentioning is the gentleman with the thistledown hair, or just the gentleman. That's the only way he's ever described. It's the only thing he's ever called in the book. He does have a name, but like no one could say it because he's a fairy. He's got a fairy name, and fairy names are complicated. He rules a hall in Fairy called the Hall of Lost Hope. And he is one of the only two characters I would consider villainous in a way. But because he's a fairy, it seems weird to call him a villain because it seems wrong to hold him to the same moral standards as one would hold the human characters. But he is a fascinating person to read about as well. He is sort of friends with Stephen Black, so they turn up a lot at the same time, which is great because those sections are really, really fun and interesting to read about. And yeah, but the rest of the cast is legit really interesting. I can't think of a single character who lets the book down. The only issues I see that could arise are with the characters who are historical figures, which is the Duke of Wellington, George III's in a chapter, and George IV's brothers are in it as well, very briefly. And it only could be a problem if perhaps they're not accurate, because I'm not a historian, I don't know. They seem pretty good to me, but I'm not sure. Although she has done a lot of research, so I can't see why they wouldn't be accurate. But that's the only reason I could think why people might not like the characters, and I don't actually think that's a reason. So, you know, make of that what you will. Next, we're talking about setting and world building, and it's always going to be difficult writing an alternative history book with magic, because not only do you have to think about how magic affects the current era, which is the Regency, but you also have to sort of think about how it affected the history that led up to this era, how it changed the Middle Ages and the Tudor times and all that stuff, and the rest of the world. Would it look the same? Would you still have the same people in charge? And because it's so difficult, I wouldn't look too hard at it, because I suppose there might be outcomes that aren't really explored in the book. But I think Susanna Clarke has done a really, really good job of incorporating magic into both the current age and the history. Mostly through the footnotes, because through the footnotes you learn all sorts of stuff about how magic was used and seen in this version of England. We learned when magic was first brought to England by a sort of almost folkloric historical figure called the Raven King, back in the 11 or 1200s, I forget the exact date, but it's around then. So England has only really had magic for a few hundred years, other than proper magic that people have been able to use. We learned there were different eras of magic, the orate magicians, or Golden Age, who were like the Middle Ages, medieval. And then they put Argentine, which makes me think of Argentina. Argentine magicians, or the Silver Age, who were a little bit later, and how magic sort of fell out of favour in the sort of 1700s. So England's been without magic for like, 100 to 200 years roughly. And there are little differences brought up with how, there's little phrases about magic and how magic and the church sort of get on or don't get on. There are explanations for various interesting bits in English history, like there's a steeple which has a twisted tower, a steeple that is twisted in a village, the name of which I've forgotten. And although there are folkloric explanations for it, this offers us a different one. It's things like that. It bleeds magic into all aspects of life and does it quite well. And also because magic seems to only really have been in England, or is used by people in England, you can sort of see why the world isn't very different. I think the biggest difference really is the fact that the King of England is only the King of the south of England. The north of England is still ruled technically by the Raven King, who didn't die, he just sort of disappeared. So the southern King of England is sort of basically looking after it sort of until he returns, a la Arthur or something. So yeah, I don't really think I have much more to say than that. It is basically Regency England, but magic exists, and it feels like magic has always existed in this England. And I think it's incorporated very, very well. Leading on from the world building is the magic system. The magic system in this is quite interesting in that it's actually based quite heavily on historical magic. I've written down real magic, I don't mean real magic, but how magic was actually thought about and practiced back in the day. People who are interested actually in that sort of magic, there's a podcast that only had 3 episodes, but those 3 episodes are very good, called Arcane History of Magic, by I think a Canadian guy who studies magic for like, that's his thing. And he did a Reddit Ask Me Anything, which I read, which is how I found him. And he says that this book is the only fantasy book that basically uses these real... He said that this fantasy book is the one that got closest to representing how magic was actually used. The magic in this book has basically come from fairies brought over with the Raven King, who ruled over a dominion in fairy hell, I think, and also England, the north of England. So he brought magic over, learned from the fairies, so actually a lot of magic in this world can be traced back to fairy magic, which comes up quite a lot because a lot of magicians, especially the orate magicians, would summon fairy servants as a sort of display of their magic and to help them complete spells and create new spells and stuff, although that's sort of fallen out of favour. And that's one of the things actually Norrell and Strange argue about, is fairies summoning and stuff. The magic system is essentially a hard system, but presented more softly. For those who don't know the terms, a hard magic system is basically a system wherein the rules of magic are strict and outlined, so the reader knows exactly what you can and cannot do with magic. The limitations are expressed quite openly. Whereas a soft magic system is a little bit more whimsical, a bit more wild, and the reader doesn't necessarily know how magic works. It's sort of stuff you get in like Lord of the Rings, where Gandalf just sort of does magic randomly. Which makes it more exciting, but also slightly frustrating if you don't really know how it works. And it's not really both, it's just because in this book, the magic system is basically like a science. Every single spell has a procedure, has a recipe, has instructions to follow. And it all seems very, very rigid. But the reader never learns any of it. So we don't really know all the limitations. We don't really know what you can and can't do. It all seems a bit random at times. So I mean, the only instructions we actually do get, and we kind of understand a little bit because it's happens so often, is a sort of spell for searching for something or someone. Where you sort of take a dish of water, you split it into 4 sections. One section represents heaven, one hell, one earth, and one fairy. Fairy being the place. And then there'll be a light where the person you're looking for is, and then you can split it again. If it's on Earth, for instance, you'd split it to 4 again. It would be England, Scotland, Ireland, or other, and then you'd keep doing that until you find the person. That's used quite a lot, but that's sort of a bit how the magic works. There are other spells that require other things like mirrors and dead things and stones and all sorts of random stuff. We don't really know how a lot of the big spells work. Often the magicians will just sort of do the magic and then the effect will happen. At one point, Strange literally moves a Belgian town across the world to North America and then back again, bringing in some new Native American additions to the army against the French. And that just happened. You don't know how it happened, don't know how he done it, but he does it. And although I can see people might find it very frustrating having this magic system but not understanding any of it, I think it works. A, because it sounds complicated, and also just kind of a bit boring. It's very, very academic, and I think most people would find it kind of dull. But also because the way the magic works isn't the important part of the book, or at least the specifics of how it works. I think the important element is that it is complicated, and it is the human way of doing it, these complicated gestures and spells and words and items, where the fairy magic is very intuitive and just sort of happens and a lot more linked to nature. So yeah, the magic system is hard, but you don't really understand any of it, and that's fine. That's not a problem. Now, I could probably say more about things like the generic plot, which is good considering there isn't really much of a plot, and the pacing, which is good considering it's a very, very long book. But there's not really much to say about those elements, just that they're pretty good. Now, I did say earlier that there is a BBC adaptation that came out in 2015 that completely passed me by, which I've only watched 1 episode of it. It's just pretty good so far, although they have had to shift a lot of things around because otherwise one of the main characters wouldn't turn up till halfway through, and that would be awkward. Yeah, we'll watch the rest of it. It'll be interesting to see how they actually translate it into a television programme, considering the book makes very, very good use of the fact it is in the written medium. So I don't know how they're going to achieve it, but they've done pretty well so far. If I have a strong enough reaction, I might do another video talking about it, but honestly, I don't think I'm going to have that strong reaction other than, oh, that was good. So, don't hold your breath. So yeah, all in all, it is a really good book. I think if you're interested in history, in magic, in the Regency era, you'd like it. It's not as gritty as a lot of modern fantasy, but it does have a certain bite to it. And it does have some quite horrible imagery if you sort of stop and think about a few bits. Some of the spells are really quite macabre, and it does have a sort of quite a dark feel to it, even though it is very amusingly written. It does feel kind of dark, especially with the front cover, with the raven and the dark green and the forests and stuff. So I do think it would appeal to most fantasy readers. There is something there for everyone. There are the darker bits for people who like the dark stuff, and then there are the funny bits for people who like the lighter stuff, and it's all wrapped up with great characters. So yeah, go and read it right now. This author needs more attention. She has written another book called Piranesi. I don't know how to say it. I don't know what it's about, but it is far shorter. So I will be reading that when I get my hands on a cheap copy of it. So that's all for now. Next week or next time I'll be back with a terrible book, so, you know, look forward to that. Ta-ra!